My name is Donna Carter, and I was 34 years old when my husband looked at me across our kitchen island and ended our marriage without technically saying the word divorce. At the time, my life looked ordinary in the way people envy, without realizing how fragile it all is. I worked as a marketing manager at a mid-sized tech company in the Midwest. Nothing flashy, but stable, respected, and steadily moving upward. I had been there for 8 years, long enough to feel like my career had roots. My husband, Daniel Carter, was 32, intelligent, articulate, and increasingly distant in ways I couldn't quite explain yet. We had been married for 6 years together, for nearly a decade if you counted college, and we lived in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb where nothing ever really happened. No kids, not yet. We had always said we were waiting until our careers settled, as if life ever truly settles. That night started like dozens of others. I came home exhausted after a long day that included a presentation that hadn't landed the way I hoped. All I wanted was comfort, familiar conversation, shared food, the quiet intimacy of being with the person who was supposed to be my anchor. Daniel was already home, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling on his phone with a focus that felt sharp, almost aggressive. I noticed it immediately, the way you notice a storm forming before the sky actually darkens. We ate dinner and talked about nothing important. His coworkers, a project delay, the safe, meaningless exchanges couples fall into when they don't want to touch anything real. Later, we moved to the living room. He stayed on his phone, deep into accounts and forums he'd been obsessed with lately, while I half-watched something forgettable on television. When I leaned over to kiss his neck, something that had once made him laugh and pull me closer, he flinched, like I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. "Don't," he said, not even looking up. I froze, confusion hitting before hurt. "You haven't been in the mood for weeks," I replied carefully, already bracing myself. "Is everything okay?" That was when he finally put his phone down and looked at me. Not with anger, not with sadness, with something colder than either. "Not tonight," he said evenly, "or any night. I'm done with that part of our relationship." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. Words like that don't land all at once. They echo, they rearrange your understanding of reality in slow, disorienting waves. I stared at him, waiting for the follow-up, the clarification, the reassurance that this wasn't what it sounded like. "What exactly do you mean?" I asked. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied calmly, almost patiently. "I'm comfortable with our life, the house, the stability, our social circle. But I'm no longer interested in physical intimacy with you, or with women in general. I've been doing a lot of reading, and I've realized how much pressure men are under to perform intimacy they don't want. I'm not participating in that expectation anymore." My chest tightened. "You're ending physical intimacy in our marriage, unilaterally." "I'm setting boundaries with my body," he said. "You can accept that or not. That's your choice." I didn't sleep in our bed that night. Not because he asked me to leave, but because lying next to someone who had just erased an entire dimension of our relationship felt unbearable. As I lay on the couch staring into the dark, one thought repeated over and over, growing louder each time it returned. Something fundamental had just been taken from me, and he was acting like it was nothing at all. The days after Daniel's declaration blurred together in a way that still unsettles me when I think back on them. Nothing visibly changed, and that was somehow worse than if everything had fallen apart at once. We still woke up in the same house, brewed coffee in the same kitchen, discussed schedules and groceries like two people playing at normalcy. If an outsider had watched us, they would have seen a functioning marriage. What they wouldn't have seen was the invisible wall that now stood between us, thick and immovable, built entirely from his certainty and my confusion. Daniel behaved as though he had announced something minor, like switching gyms or cutting sugar out of his diet. There was no follow-up conversation, no emotional check-in, no acknowledgement that he had fundamentally altered the terms of our marriage. He didn't ask how I was coping or whether I needed time to process. In his mind, the issue was resolved the moment he spoke the words. Any discomfort that followed was apparently mine to manage alone. I tried at first to approach it gently. I told myself that marriages went through phases, that people changed, that this didn't necessarily mean the end. I asked questions carefully, afraid that one wrong phrase would make me sound accusatory or demanding. Each attempt was met with the same calm deflection, the same intellectual language that made my emotional pain feel petty and outdated. When I suggested counseling a few days later, having already researched therapists and availability, he didn't even hesitate. "There's nothing wrong with me," he said, rolling his eyes as if I'd suggested something absurd. "I'm not going to therapy so someone can pressure me into intimacy I don't want. Maybe you should go instead to unpack why you're so dependent on physical validation." The words landed harder than I expected. I wasn't asking for validation. I was asking for connection, for partnership, for some acknowledgement that marriage meant more than shared bills and polite coexistence. But every time I tried to explain that, he reframed it. Suddenly, I wasn't a wife trying to save her marriage. I was a woman clinging to outdated expectations, someone who couldn't handle his autonomy. At night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last year of our life together. I searched for signs I might have missed moments where he pulled away, and I was too distracted or too trusting to notice. Our intimacy had slowed, yes, but nothing that felt alarming. We still went on dates, still held hands, still said "I love you" before falling asleep, right up until the moment he decided that those words no longer carried any obligation toward me. The realization crept in slowly and painfully. Whatever emotional withdrawal he'd been experiencing, he had processed it privately and completely before ever inviting me into the conversation. During the day, he moved through the house with an ease that felt cruel in its indifference. He joked about work, complained about traffic, shared articles he'd read, as if nothing fundamental had changed. Meanwhile, I felt like I was grieving a marriage that was technically still alive. I was expected to perform normalcy without being allowed to mourn what I'd lost. Every time I expressed hurt, it was reframed as pressure. Every time I asked for clarity, it was labeled entitlement. One Saturday morning, after another sleepless night, I tried one last time to understand. I asked him quietly if I had done something wrong, if there was anything I could change or work on. He sighed heavily, the way someone does when they feel burdened by another person's ignorance. "This is exactly the problem," he said. "You're making my personal journey about you. Not everything revolves around your feelings, Donna. The fact that you think it does just proves how conditioned women are to expect emotional labor from men." That was the moment something inside me went still. I realized there was no version of this conversation where I wasn't already guilty in his eyes. Any attempt to advocate for myself simply reinforced the narrative he had constructed, one where he was enlightened, and I was a relic clinging to a version of marriage he'd already outgrown. I walked away from him that morning, not because I agreed, but because I finally understood that there was no common ground left to stand on. A week later, I found myself sitting in my car outside our house after work, hands resting on the steering wheel, unable to go inside. The thought of another evening of polite detachment, another night of lying next to someone who had reduced me to a convenience, filled me with a kind of quiet dread. That was when the truth finally settled in, heavy but clarifying. I was still married on paper, but in every way that mattered, I was alone. And if I stayed exactly as I was, waiting, hoping, negotiating for scraps of connection, nothing would change. He had already chosen his version of freedom. The only question left was whether I was willing to choose mine. The decision didn't arrive with drama or tears. It came quietly, almost timidly, as I lay awake one morning before dawn, staring at the faint line of light creeping along the bedroom wall. I realized that waiting for Daniel to reconsider, to soften, or to suddenly remember that I was his wife was slowly erasing me. If I stayed in that suspended state much longer, I wouldn't recognize myself at all, so I stopped waiting. The first change was small enough that it felt harmless. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m., a full hour before Daniel usually woke up. Those early mornings became mine in a way nothing had been in months. The house was silent, empty of tension, free of the careful, emotional calculations I'd been making since his declaration. I started each day sitting on the living room floor, breathing slowly, letting the thoughts come and go without chasing them. I had always dismissed meditation as something I didn't have time for, but in that stillness, I felt my nervous system unclench for the first time since my marriage fractured. After that, I began moving my body. Nothing extreme at first, just stretching light strength exercises, a short run through the neighborhood while the sky was still gray. The physical effort grounded me. It reminded me that I existed beyond my role as someone's wife, beyond the silent rejection waiting for me at home every evening. By the time Daniel wandered into the kitchen, I was already showered, dressed, and drinking coffee with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "You're up early," he remarked one morning, glancing at me with mild surprise. "Just making some changes," I replied casually. He hummed in response, muttering something under his breath about productivity culture before retreating back to his phone. I didn't care. For once, his commentary didn't dictate my choices. The second week, I joined a gym near my office. Instead of rushing home after work to sit across from someone who barely acknowledged me, I stayed late lifting weights running until my muscles burned and my mind went quiet. The sweat, the repetition, the slow progress, it all became a kind of therapy. Each workout pushed a little more resentment out of my system, replaced by something steadier. Control. I also began reconnecting with parts of myself I had slowly abandoned. Photography had once been my escape. Something I loved long before marriage turned every hobby into a negotiation about time and priorities. I dusted off my old camera, invested in better equipment, and started waking up early on weekends to drive out to nearby trails. Standing alone at sunrise, framing landscapes through my lens, I felt present in a way I hadn't in years. The world felt bigger than my marriage again, and that realization was both terrifying and liberating. Daniel noticed, of course. He always did. But his interest was superficial, edged with irritation rather than curiosity. When I came home later than usual one evening, smelling faintly of sweat and cold air, he commented that I seemed very busy lately, as if my independence were a personal inconvenience. "I'm just redirecting my energy," I said calmly, "into things that make me feel good." The words tasted unfamiliar, but right. Financially, I started doing the same. Daniel and I had always maintained separate accounts alongside our joint one for household expenses. I continued contributing my share, but quietly redirected my discretionary spending into a separate savings account he had no access to. It wasn't about revenge or secrecy, it was about security. Knowing that I could stand on my own if I needed to gave me a sense of stability I hadn't realized I was missing. Within a month, the changes were visible. My body felt stronger, my sleep improved, even my posture shifted as if my spine had finally decided it was allowed to hold me upright again. When I caught my reflection in the mirror one morning, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked clearer, more focused, less apologetic. Daniel tried to disguise his reaction as indifference, but it leaked out in small ways. A critical comment about my clothes being a bit much. A sarcastic remark about how I was clearly having some kind of reinvention phase. I responded with polite smiles and silence, and that seemed to bother him more than any argument ever could. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't a phase. It was a quiet reclamation. I wasn't becoming someone new, I was returning to the person I had slowly put aside to keep our marriage comfortable. And for the first time since his declaration, I wasn't measuring my progress by whether he noticed or approved. I was building something of my own, and deep down I sensed that once that process truly began, there was no going back to the woman who waited to be chosen. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It showed up in Daniel's questions. They were subtle at first, disguised as casual curiosity, but I recognized the change immediately because it was the first time in months he had directed genuine attention toward me. Not warmth, not affection, attention. The kind that comes when someone senses control slipping through their fingers. "Where are you going so early on Saturdays?" he asked one morning as I reached for my car keys, camera bag slung over my shoulder. "Out," I said simply. "To do what?" "Take photos." The pause that followed was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Since when are you into photography again?" I looked at him, genuinely surprised by the question. "I've always been into photography. I just didn't have time before." He frowned slightly, as if trying to locate the version of me he thought he still understood. "You used to say it took too much time." "I used to say a lot of things," I replied, not unkindly. That answer unsettled him. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way he returned to his phone without another word. For months he had operated under the assumption that I would remain static, emotionally available, physically absent, financially stable, and infinitely patient. My redirection disrupted that quiet arrangement, and he didn't yet know how to respond. At work, the changes in me translated into momentum. With my emotional energy no longer trapped in a constant state of confusion, I approached projects with clarity and confidence. I volunteered for high-visibility assignments. I spoke up in meetings without second-guessing myself. My boss noticed. So did my colleagues. Compliments started coming in, not exaggerated, just genuine acknowledgement of competence and leadership. After feeling invisible at home for so long, it was almost disorienting to be seen again. That was how Andrew Collins entered my orbit. Andrew was a few years older than me, worked in a different department, and had a quiet, steady presence that immediately set him apart. There was nothing performative about him. He listened when people spoke. He asked thoughtful questions. When he smiled, it wasn't strategic, it was warm. We started talking during a cross-team project, our conversations drifting naturally from work into shared interests. When he mentioned hiking, I told him about my photography outings. When I showed him a few of my shots during a break, his reaction was immediate and unfiltered. "These are incredible," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a real eye." There was no flirtation in his tone, no expectation behind the compliment. And yet something in my chest tightened anyway, not with desire, but with recognition. This was what mutual respect felt like. This was what it sounded like when someone valued you without trying to own you. I kept my distance deliberately. I wasn't interested in blurring lines or escaping one complicated situation by creating another. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. Andrew treated me like a full person. Daniel treated me like an accessory who had started malfunctioning. Daniel began noticing Andrew's existence, not because I mentioned him, but because he started appearing in my world, in stories from work, in group photos posted. After team events, in my increasingly relaxed demeanor when I came home from long days. One evening, after scrolling through my phone longer than usual, Daniel asked, "Who's the guy in that picture you posted?" "Andrew," I replied. "We work together. He seems to be in a lot of your photos lately." "He's part of the team," I said calmly. "We had a project milestone." The silence that followed was heavier this time. "He's attractive," Daniel said, finally watching my face carefully. I shrugged. I hadn't really noticed. It wasn't entirely true, but it also wasn't a lie that mattered. What unsettled Daniel wasn't the idea that I might find someone else attractive. It was the realization that I might no longer be orienting my life around his approval. He had assumed exclusivity of attention without offering exclusivity of intimacy, and now that imbalance was being exposed. That night, he cooked dinner for the first time in months. He asked about my day. He even suggested we watch something together afterward, choosing a show we used to enjoy. The sudden effort was so transparent, it almost hurt. I recognized it for what it was, not remorse, not growth, but recalibration. A strategic attempt to pull me back into a familiar orbit now that he sensed I was drifting beyond his reach. I played along politely. I answered his questions. I sat beside him on the couch. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer starving for scraps of attention. I was no longer measuring my worth by whether he noticed me. And because of that, his renewed interest landed flat. Later that night, as I lay awake beside him listening to his steady breathing, I understood something with absolute clarity. Daniel wasn't afraid of losing me emotionally. He had already let that happen. What frightened him now was the possibility that I might no longer need him at all. And once that fear entered the room, there was no putting it back in its cage. Once I saw the shift in Daniel, I couldn't unsee it. His renewed attentiveness wasn't rooted in regret or self-reflection. It was driven by something far more primitive: control. He had been comfortable redefining our marriage on his terms, as long as he believed I would remain exactly where he left me. The moment my life began expanding beyond his line of sight, his certainty started to crack. Around that same time, my own world kept opening in ways I hadn't planned, but welcomed anyway. At work, my performance reviews took on a noticeably different tone. I wasn't just reliable anymore, I was indispensable. When a leadership position opened up on a high-profile initiative, my name was mentioned without hesitation. I felt it in the way meetings shifted, when I spoke in the way decisions leaned subtly in my direction. The confidence I'd rebuilt quietly was now visible, undeniable. Andrew and I continued working closely, and though we kept everything professional, the ease between us deepened. Our conversations were effortless, grounded in shared respect rather than unspoken expectations. There was no emotional dependency, no flirtation disguised as concern, just two adults enjoying each other's company in a way that felt healthy. I didn't miss the contrast so much as I felt awakened by it. Then, through one of those loose threads that inevitably connect professional circles in a mid-sized city, I learned something I wasn't meant to know. Daniel's company was merging with a larger firm. Entire departments were being evaluated for redundancy, and his was near the top of the list. It wasn't gossip or insider trading, just information floating quietly through the same channels that had always carried news like this. I sat with it for days, weighing what it meant. There was a time when I would have rushed to him, warned him, strategized together. That instinct still surfaced, reflexive, familiar, but it no longer controlled me. I remembered every conversation where my pain had been reframed as inconvenience. Every night I'd stared at the ceiling, wondering how my marriage had become so conditional. And for the first time, I chose silence. Instead, I prepared. I met with a lawyer, discreetly paying from the account I'd built piece by piece over the past months. I learned what my options were, what documentation mattered, how to protect myself financially if things turned adversarial. I wrote everything down: his declaration, the timeline, the emotional withdrawal, the refusal to pursue counseling. Not out of spite, but clarity. I wasn't interested in drama. I was interested in freedom without ruin. Daniel, meanwhile, sensed something approaching, even if he didn't yet know what it was. He became restless, more volatile. Some days he was almost charming, asking about my schedule, suggesting dinners out, laughing too loudly at jokes that fell flat. Other days he was withdrawn and irritable, snapping at small things, accusing me of being distant, distracted, unavailable. The irony never escaped me. One evening, as we ate dinner in tense silence, he finally said it. "You've changed," he accused. "You're barely home anymore." I set my fork down calmly. "I'm adapting." To what he demanded. "To the reality you set," I replied evenly. "You chose independence. I'm just honoring that." His jaw tightened. "That's not the same thing." "It feels pretty equivalent from where I'm standing." He didn't have an answer for that. He never did when logic replaced emotion. The announcement came 2 weeks later. Layoffs. Entire teams eliminated. Daniel came home early that day, his expression hollow in a way I'd never seen before. He dropped his bag by the door and sat heavily at the kitchen table, hands pressed flat against the surface like he needed something solid to keep himself upright. "I lost my job," he said quietly. I felt a flicker of sympathy, human, instinctive, but it didn't override everything else. "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied. "That's hard." He looked up at me, eyes searching my face for something. Comfort, reassurance, rescue. "I don't know what I'm going to do." The silence stretched between us. In that moment, I understood how drastically the power dynamic had shifted. Months ago, I had stood in that same kitchen, emotionally exposed, asking for reassurance he never offered. Now, he was the one unmoored, and for the first time, I wasn't obligated to catch him. "You'll figure it out," I said finally. "You always do." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true, and they echoed something he had once said to me when I was unraveling. He noticed the distance immediately, the absence of urgency, and something in his face tightened. He was beginning to understand that the safety net he'd taken for granted was no longer beneath him. That night, as I lay awake listening to him pace the house, I knew the collapse had begun. Not just of his job, but of the version of our marriage where he dictated terms without consequences. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. The next move would change everything, and for the first time I was ready to make it. Daniel's job loss didn't soften him the way hardship sometimes does. It stripped away his certainty, yes, but what surfaced underneath wasn't humility, it was expectation. He assumed that despite everything, I would step into the familiar role of emotional ballast, absorbing his panic the way I had absorbed my own months earlier. He assumed the marriage hollow, as it was still guaranteed him access to my stability. The morning after he told me, he sat at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. "I need some time," he said, voice tight, "to process, to figure out next steps." "I understand," I replied, calmly buttering toast. "Just keep me updated on how you plan to handle your share of the expenses." His head snapped up. "What?" "The mortgage, utilities, insurance," I said evenly. "Those don't pause just because things are stressful." He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "I just lost my job, Donna. You can't seriously be bringing up money right now." I met his gaze without flinching. "We've always contributed equally. That was important to you. I'm just maintaining the structure you insisted on." Anger flashed across his face quickly, followed by disbelief. "So that's it. No support, no compassion." "I'm being practical," I said. "You taught me that feelings don't override personal autonomy." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were his. I watched them register in real time, watched him realize that the language he'd used to dismiss my pain could be turned just as cleanly against him. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved quietly through the house. I transferred the remaining funds from our joint account into my private one, leaving just enough to prevent immediate penalties. I packed a bag with essentials documents, closed my camera, and placed it by the door. When Daniel came out of the bedroom towel around his waist, I was waiting in the living room with a folder in my hands. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Divorce papers," I said, calmly handing them to him. "I'm done living in a one-sided marriage." His reaction unfolded in stages: confusion, anger, panic. "You can't be serious. This is because I set boundaries. This is because you changed the terms of our marriage without discussion or compromise," I replied, and expected me to accept the fallout quietly. He scoffed. "So what, you're leaving me now that things are hard?" I almost laughed at the irony. I stayed when things were hard for me. You just didn't notice. When he realized the money was gone, his composure cracked. "You move the funds, Donna. I don't have income right now. How am I supposed to live?" I felt no satisfaction, only clarity. "That's not my responsibility anymore. You wanted independence. This is what it looks like." He accused me of cruelty, of manipulation, of planning this from the beginning. I corrected him once. "I planned this from the moment I realized I was disposable." Over the next days, his tone shifted. The ideology vanished, replaced by desperation. He suggested counseling, apologized vaguely, even tried to initiate intimacy one night, touching my arm, as if months of emotional erasure could be undone with proximity. I pulled away without anger. "That door is closed," I said simply. His friends called, then his parents. Each conversation followed the same script: how I was being harsh, how marriage meant standing by each other in crisis. I listened politely, then declined involvement. Daniel had made his choice months earlier. I was only making mine now. 2 weeks later, I told him I was moving out. The papers were ready. If he contested them, the legal process would be long and expensive, something neither of us truly wanted. If he signed, I would provide a one-time settlement to help him transition. "You planned this," he said quietly, staring at the documents. "No," I replied. I adapted. He signed. The next morning, I walked out of the house that had once felt like a shared future and loaded my car with the last of my things. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. By the time I drove away, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd won, but because I was finally free from negotiating my worth. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city, one I'd secured quietly weeks before everything imploded. It wasn't grand, but it was mine in a way the house with Daniel never truly had been. The first night I slept there, the silence felt different, not heavy or lonely, but clean. For the first time in months, maybe years, I slept without bracing myself for disappointment. The divorce finalized faster than I expected. Daniel didn't contest it. He took the settlement, and from what I later heard through mutual acquaintances, moved back in with his parents in another state. The ideological certainty he'd once wielded so confidently seemed to evaporate when faced with practical reality. I didn't feel vindicated by that knowledge. Mostly I felt distant, as if that version of my life belonged to someone else entirely. My own world kept expanding. The promotion at work became official, along with a substantial raise and increased travel opportunities. I accepted them without guilt, without checking whether my ambition made someone else uncomfortable. On weekends, I hiked with my camera, chasing light, capturing moments that reminded me how vast and indifferent the world could be, and how freeing that indifference was. Andrew remained part of my life throughout it all, steady and respectful. He never pushed, never assumed. When I told him about the divorce, he listened without interruption, without trying to fix anything. Months later, when our friendship naturally deepened into something more, it felt earned rather than rushed. There were no negotiations about autonomy, no ideological frameworks to justify emotional withdrawal. Just mutual care, clear communication, and a shared sense that partnership should add to your life, not hollow it out. 6 months after the divorce, my first photography exhibition opened at a small local gallery. On the wall hung a landscape shot taken at dawn. The morning I'd stood on a ridge camera in hand, realizing I deserved better. I watched people study the image, saw them feel something I hadn't put into words, and understood that creation had become my language again. Occasionally, Daniel still tried to reach out. Short messages, practical questions. I kept communication minimal and factual, responding only when legally necessary. The distance wasn't spiteful, it was protective. Some connections aren't meant to be repaired, they're meant to be learned from. Looking back, I don't see my departure as revenge. I see it as alignment. Daniel chose to redefine our marriage in a way that erased my needs while preserving his comfort. I chose to step away from a structure that no longer supported me. The consequences weren't cruel or kind, they were simply inevitable. What this experience taught me is something I carry quietly now. Self-respect isn't dramatic. It doesn't shout or threaten. Sometimes it just packs a bag, signs papers, and walks away without asking for permission. And if you're standing in a relationship where the rules keep changing without your consent, listen carefully. That silence you're feeling isn't peace. It's your intuition asking you to choose yourself.